What is going on, guys? Well, with the release of The Exorcist Believer this weekend, we now have 6 films officially in the Exorcist franchise. So you know what that means. It's time to discuss all 6 films and rank them from worst to best on my own personal preference scale. I have fully reviewed every single movie in this franchise. I'll stick a card up here for that playlist if you want my more in-depth thoughts on any or all of these movies. I also included this in 31 on 31 one year called Unholy Terrors, where we took on demon possession and haunting movies and 31 franchise films together, one of which was The Exorcist. So if you're a fan of this franchise, there's a lot of other things on this channel for you to check out. Now with that being said, let's go ahead and kick this thing off with number 6, the movie that definitively is the worst in this franchise. I would be fascinated to have a conversation with somebody that actually likes and defends this movie, but I don't think anybody on earth, for the most part, is going to have any issues with The Exorcist II being my least favorite in this franchise. Pretty much every single time that I have done a review series on a major horror franchise, there has always been at least 1 or 2 installments in that franchise that everybody warns me about. Oh, if you haven't seen that one, whoo, get ready for the ride that's going to take you on. And I'd say about 95% of the time when somebody really sells how bad a movie is going to be, when I eventually see it, it always feels like it was oversold. It's like, yeah, I mean, that was bad, but it wasn't that bad. This was decent about it. This was watchable. I don't think he gave enough credit to this. Exorcist II the Heretic was not one of those situations. In fact, I think a lot of you guys undersold how bad this movie was. This is one of the most shockingly bad sequels to a horror classic I have ever seen. I mean, it's just terrible idea after terrible idea after terrible idea to follow up The Exorcist, and all of those ideas are executed horrendously. This is a movie that is just so shockingly bad that I think the only appeal that it has is how much of a disaster piece it is, and just the question of who the fuck greenlit this script and put all this time and money and energy into this, thinking that fans of The Exorcist was going to be on board for this. I mean, you've got archaeological digs going on with James Earl Jones in like fucking Kali Ma makeup doing his own thing. You got Reagan and Nurse Ratched over here trying to do their own sci-fi movie with like brain linking devices. You got evil locusts and grasshoppers and defeating the fucking devil with a little dance. I mean, I'm saying all these things, and if you haven't seen the movie, you think I'm bullshitting. Like, you think I'm just making this up on the spot. No, that's the plot of the fucking movie. So no matter how frustrating or insulting or just mind-numbingly dull some of the other installments in this franchise is, none of them have hit the depths of hell the way that The Exorcist II the Heretic is. Easily the worst in this franchise. And now we have 3 movies that are all wildly different and have wildly unique issues that, if I'm being honest, are pretty much dead even for me. They could all be a 3-way tie for number 5, but it's not the way these things work. So what do you favor? Do you favor the really dramatic and serious but incredibly dull and boring prequel, the way over stylized prequel that just feels like generic Studio 2000s horror, or the incredibly cynical and cash grabby sequel that we all just saw over the past couple days? Let me ponder. As of right now, number 5 for me is going to be Dominion, a prequel to The Exorcist. Now, very quickly, for a brief little history on the story with Dominion as well as Exorcist the Beginning, which we have not discussed yet. Dominion was put into production as a prequel to The Exorcist. They hired the writer, I believe, from Taxi Driver to direct this. They shot the entire fucking movie, and then when they went to go turn everything in, the studio said, whoa, this isn't horror enough. This isn't Exorcist enough. This isn't something that modern audiences are going to like. So they hire Rennie Harlin, of all people, who was very famous in the 90s for being an action director like Cliffhanger, Die Hard 2, also gave us Nightmare on Elm Street 4. A guy with a lot of style, but goes very just balls to the wall with things that he does visually on screen. They hired him to do some reshoots, and reshoots turned into reshooting the entire fucking movie, and then they released Exorcist the Beginning, Rennie Harlin's film, to theaters, which did not do so well, was not received very well, and then they panicked, finished up Dominion, and then released that afterwards, which was received better, but made even less money at the box office. So Dominion is the movie that was shot first by the Taxi Driver writer, and while I think Objectively, on paper, this is probably a better movie than Exorcist the Beginning. This is probably a better script and is a little bit more professionally in line with the quality you would expect from a prequel to The Exorcist. I also think that it loses a lot of the sight of the horror of things. This feels much more like an archaeological drama that's exploring the crisis of faith, and there's elements of The Exorcist in there, mostly in the last 15 minutes or so, but for me, it's the most dull of all these movies. Like, it's more profound, it's a little bit more going on as far as the script writing, but it's very slow. And when I'm in the mood for an Exorcist film, the tone this movie goes for is just not what I am going for whatsoever. So for me, this is the one that I would rewatch least of these three here in the middle. Coming in at number 4 is going to be The Exorcist Believer. Now, this is a movie that objectively is just fine. It's actually kind of painfully fine. It is slickly produced, it has studio backing, you can tell there's a budget there, there's solid acting, there is professional filmmaking going on, but this is a movie that is one of, if not the most cynical and lazy cash grabs that I have seen in this era of modern horror legacy sequels. First of all, The Exorcist is a movie that I don't believe makes sense to be a franchise despite having 6 films now. And so when you look at the objective of how are we going to follow up what is most commonly called the scariest movie of all time with a modern movie and pay respect to that film and pave the way for a trilogy of films that they announced so arrogantly, how are we going to do that? Well, let's just take the most generic fucking run-of-the-mill Exorcist script that feels like all of the dozens and dozens of Exorcist ripoffs, and we're just going to shoehorn the fuck out of a couple of cameos to make it a little bit more official than all of those ripoffs. And that approach just offends me as a horror fan. It just aggravates the fuck out of me. It feels like a major corporate studio just trying to milk the tit of horror fandom. And I don't stand for that shit. If you're going to put something out there that has the legacy sequel attitude behind it, which is fuck all those other movies that you made, we're the true follow-up to the original, then you better put some goddamn effort into it instead of just dusting off some basic-ass January, February Exorcist script and writing Reagan on every 4th page and saying, that's good enough, that's an Exorcist sequel. The story about a single father and his struggle to save his daughter who is being possessed by a demonic entity along with her white friend that gets zero character development whatsoever. That was a decent enough place to start, but they just rushed through everything. That's a decent enough first act to get things going. Then you get to the second act where it just becomes the legacy sequel shoehorn segment where they just throw Ellen Burstyn in there for the fuck of it, give her nothing to do, and then quickly push her off to the side for the third act where the exorcism stuff happens and the creative decisions that they decided to go for with the exorcism and the rules that this movie is going to abide by that are so contradictory to the rules of the first film. As somebody who's a casual fan of the original Exorcist, I just can't fathom how any hardcore fan could look at this and say, that's a decent enough effort. I'm on board, guys. Bring on the 2 sequels. And finally, something that I did not take the time to even address in my review because it was almost 20 minutes long. I'm usually the person that is telling everybody to just calm down and please just shut the fuck up when it comes to calling everything in sight woke and everything in sight progressive. There are a few moments in this movie that are so blatantly just shoved in there like a square peg in a round hole to have something that appeals to modern audiences that it was fucking vomit inducing. When you have Ellen Burstyn's character looking at Leslie Odom Jr. in the eye, straight face serious and saying, you know, I think the reason why I wasn't in the room when my daughter had her exorcism is because I wasn't part of the patriarchy. Yeah, okay, good thought, bitch. Fuck the 2 guys that gave their life to save your daughter. You're right, girl power.
A bullshit. A bullshit. A bullshit. A bullshit.
In conclusion, I'm sure Blumhouse is going to find a way to make a profit off of this, but this was a horrible start for this trilogy. And though I'm probably going to be obligated to cover the next 2 if I did not have a movie channel, I would not fucking bother with them. That's how much this movie turned me off. Coming in at number 3 is going to be Exorcist The Beginning, the reshot version that was released to theaters first of Dominion, directed by Rennie Harlin. And This is a generic 2000s horror movie with some somewhat superficial things thrown in to tie to The Exorcist. But it at least feels more appropriate as a prequel to The Exorcist to me than Dominion does. You know, there is some gory stuff in there thrown in that's absolutely like Rennie Harlan style and just kind of putting in a little bit more of an extreme nature in there that I think feels natural to the movie, but it at least makes it stand out. You have Father Merrin here, who is a little bit more entertaining of a character, I believe, even if the gravitas is artificially turned up a little bit by Skarsgård. The third act, where you have Natalia from GoldenEye turning into Pazuzu, and the makeup and the voice and just the visuals very much call back to that first film. It's a movie that's fine. You know, it's innocently generic. It's something that I would probably never watch again, but of these three here in the middle, it's the one that offends me the least. It's the one that entertains me the most, which is still a very low bar. It's okay. You know, if you threw this on, I would not be miserable watching it. I would just be like, man, the wasted potential. And now we've arrived at the only two movies in this franchise that are worth talking about. And though this always seems to get people's panties in a twist, my God's honest answer for number two is the original Exorcist. This is a movie that fits into that category for me of films that I respect more than I actually enjoy. This is a movie that I saw for the first time when I was like 10 years old, back in a day when I was so hungry as a horror fan. There were so many movies that I had yet to experience that all it took was my dad or my uncle or my mom or somebody close to me saying something interesting about a horror flick, and I would go to the movie store, the video store, and I would seek that thing out, rent it immediately, and experience it. And that happened with me with The Exorcist, with everybody telling me, oh, it's the scariest movie ever. And I just didn't feel like it was the scariest movie ever. For whatever reason, the things that were going on in this film just did not penetrate my soul and follow me into my nightmares the way that a few other films did when I was a child. As I grew older and I was able to understand the themes of the movie a lot better, like things going on with Father Karras and what the movie was actually trying to say, of course I enjoyed it more as an adult than I did as a kid. But it has never been a movie that has had this gigantic impact on me. So I think that, especially for the time that it came out in the 70s, I'm sure this thing was just shocking as hell. You know, all those headlines that we see nowadays trying to promote the new Saw movie about people are vomiting and passing out in the aisles, go see this thing now. I actually believe those stories in the original Exorcist, people just not believing what they are seeing on screen. The makeup effects, the head spinning, the pee vomit, the levitating, the dialogue and the sound design coming out of Reagan and the things that that little girl was saying to all these characters, extremely shocking. And there's not really been any Exorcist movie since that's been able to capture that. That's why The Exorcist will always be at the top of the mountain as far as demon possession films. And there's just never going to be a movie that's going to top it, because nowadays they're afraid to go that far. I mean, The Exorcist Believer, perfect example right there. Nothing in that movie even comes close to as shocking or as impactful as The Exorcist, and it's never going to be. So this thing has a legacy you can't touch. It's one of the most iconic and celebrated movies of all time, the most popular answer that people will give you for scariest films of all time, and it's one that I do like, but it's just never been one of my favorites. But coming in at number one for me is The Exorcist III, a movie that, to me, is extremely underappreciated and extremely underrated. I think that this thing gets a bad rep because of how bad Exorcist II was, that after that people are like, fuck that, I'm not watching any more sequels to The Exorcist. And while I understand that, that is a bit of a shame, because The Exorcist III to me is genuinely an incredible horror film. Now, you definitely get the vibe when you watch this that this movie started as something and then it was kind of artificially turned into an Exorcist sequel. But even with that being a fact, I do think that it succeeds pretty well at carrying over some of the story from the original Exorcist, primarily with the character of Father Karras being eternally tormented by these demons for what he did in the first film. I think that that's a cool follow-up that doesn't try to emulate what the first Exorcist did, which is what makes this so stand out to me. You have this detective that is hunting down a serial killer with all these unexplained murders lately that fit the MO of a serial killer that's been dead for 10 years. And eventually it leads him to this discovery of that serial killer, the Gemini killer, inhabiting the body of Father Karras. And so he ends up having this kind of dual objective that almost contradicts itself, where he's trying to stop these murders with a entity that can't be stopped like a normal killer, that can literally just body jump, as well as trying to save the eternal soul of Father Karras and free him from this torment. And so it's just a really interesting story to me that I get much more into that than I do the story of the first film, just always have. I think that this has one of the greatest, if not the greatest, jump scares of all time. All these modern studio and filmmakers that just want to shove jump scares into their movie and call it scary, you need to study that decapitation scene in that hallway and figure out why that works so well and try to emulate that. No more of these fucking cats jumping out from you behind the fridge door bullshit. I also think that Brad Dourif gives his best performance of his career here that I genuinely think is Oscar worthy. It's terrifying. And while the exorcism third act feels a little shoehorned in, it's also kind of visually a really cool sequence. So I've always loved this film. It's always been my number one in this franchise. And I feel like if they were ever going to make a good Exorcist follow-up in modern times, they should follow the template of this and doing something that is very much unique and just has slight tethers to The Exorcist, rather than the direction that they've decided to go time and time again, which is recreate something that will never be recreated. So if you haven't checked it out, highly encourage you, check out The Exorcist 3, treat yourself, don't listen to the naysayers. You know, it might not top The Exorcist for you, but it's a fucking awesome movie. For me, it's my number one. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click over here for all of my 2023 new release reviews so far. I'm also going to link you to that Unholy Terrors 31 on 31 with all the Exorcist movies and Insidious and Shining and a few other franchises. Like, share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss all of my upcoming Saw rankings for the next week. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.